I didn't order a woman who argues. I ordered a wife. Thomas Whitaker said it like a man who'd never been wrong about anything, standing in his own doorway, hat in hand, staring at the stranger who'd just told him his kitchen was lonely and his fence line was backwards. Eleanor Hayes didn't flinch. She set down her suitcase, looked him dead in the eye and said, "Then send me back. But before you do, your south pasture is draining wrong, and you're going to lose cattle by August." He didn't send her back. Subscribe to our channel and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Thomas Whitaker had written the letter on a Tuesday evening in February, sitting at the same kitchen table where he'd eaten alone for 6 years. He wasn't a man who struggled with most things. He knew how to break frozen ground before sunrise. He knew how to pull a calf in a blizzard when the temperature dropped so low his hands stopped feeling like hands. He knew how to calculate yield on 200 acres without writing down a single number. But the letter took him 4 tries. Not because he didn't know what to say, because he wasn't sure what he was asking for. He finally settled on something simple, something that didn't embarrass him too much if anybody ever read it. I am a widower of 6 years age, 38, with a working farm in the Montana Territory. I am looking for a woman who is honest, hard-working, and willing to live a quiet life. I do not require beauty or wealth. I require reliability. If that suits you, write back. He signed it. Thomas Whitaker, Cutters Creek, Montana. He mailed it before he could talk himself out of it. 3 months passed. The agency sent him 2 letters, one from a woman in Ohio who wanted to know if he had indoor plumbing, and one from a woman in Pennsylvania who wrote 4 pages about her roses. He put both letters in the stove. Then the 3rd letter arrived. It was 1 paragraph long. My name is Eleanor Hayes. I am 26 years old. I am not afraid of hard work or hard winters. I do not expect a fairy tale. I expect honesty, and I will give you the same. If that is sufficient, I will be on the westbound stage from Billings on the 14th of June. Thomas read it twice. Then he wrote back 1 sentence. I'll be there. He told himself it was a practical arrangement. He told himself that every morning for the 4 weeks between her letter and the 14th of June, he didn't clean the house for her. He didn't plant extra flowers or put curtains in the windows. He told himself that wasn't the kind of arrangement this was. He was getting someone to help run the farm, someone to share the load. Not a romance, not a second chance at something he'd buried with his wife Clara 6 years ago. He told himself all of that right up until the moment the stagecoach stopped on the edge of his property and the door swung open. Eleanor Hayes stepped down onto Montana soil like she'd been waiting her whole life to plant her feet somewhere. She wasn't what he'd pictured. He hadn't exactly pictured anything he'd been careful not to, but whatever shape he hadn't let himself imagine, she wasn't that either. She was slight, but she stood like she wasn't. Her dress was plain and travel-worn. Her hair was pinned up in the practical way of a woman who doesn't have time to fuss with it. She had 1 suitcase and a worn leather notebook tucked under her arm like it was something she'd sooner lose a hand than put down. She looked at him. Then she looked past him at the house, the barn, the outbuildings, the fence line stretching west. Then she looked back at him. Where does the water come from in winter? Thomas opened his mouth, closed it. In his experience, people arriving for the first time at a place said things like, "What a beautiful property," or "It's bigger than I expected," or just stood there taking it in with that particular expression of adjustment that meant they were figuring out how they felt. Nobody had ever opened with water logistics. "There's a well," he said. "Fed from a spring under the east pasture. Doesn't freeze." She nodded like he'd passed a test she hadn't told him he was taking. "What about the ridge line to the north?" she said. "How much wind do you get off it in January?" "Enough," he said. "Does it come straight down or does it wrap around the barn?" He stared at her. "It wraps," he said. She nodded again, her eyes moving to the barn roof like she was calculating something. Thomas Whitaker had been on this land for 14 years. In all that time, only 2 people had ever asked him about the way the wind moved around the barn in January. One was his father, who'd helped him build it. The other was his foreman, Joe Briggs, who'd been running cattle with him for a decade. This woman had been on his property for 40 seconds. He picked up her suitcase before he decided to. "Come on," he said. "I'll show you the house." The wagon ride to the farmhouse took 10 minutes. In those 10 minutes, Eleanor asked him about the soil composition in the east field, whether he rotated his crops, how many head of cattle he ran, whether he'd had trouble with the creek flooding in spring, and what the nearest town offered in terms of supplies. Thomas answered every question. He wasn't sure why. He wasn't a man who talked much. His foreman Joe had been known to say that getting 3 consecutive sentences out of Thomas Whitaker was harder than pulling a stuck wagon wheel out of mud. But Eleanor didn't ask questions the way most people did, waiting politely, nodding, already thinking about the next thing they wanted to say. She asked, and then she listened, and when he answered, she sometimes followed up with something that made it clear she'd actually heard him. By the time they reached the farmhouse, he'd told her more about his land than he'd told most people in a year. He realized it as he pulled the wagon to a stop. He didn't say anything about it. He just climbed down and carried her suitcase to the front porch. The house was what it was. He'd never seen it the way a stranger would, but standing on the porch with Eleanor, while she looked at it, he noticed things. The front curtain Clara had made was faded to almost no color at all. The porch board third from the left had a soft spot he kept meaning to replace. The window boxes were empty. They'd been empty for years. Eleanor looked at all of it without expression. Then she said, "Can I see the kitchen?" He took her inside. The kitchen was functional. He'd made sure of that. There was a stove that worked a water pump at the sink shelves with enough dry goods to last a month. He kept it clean in the way a man keeps things clean when he's the only one who sees it, which meant it was not exactly clean. Eleanor walked to the window above the sink and looked out. "Good light," she said. "Morning or afternoon?" "Morning." She nodded. She ran her hand along the edge of the work table. She opened the stove door, checked the firebox, closed it again. Then she turned and looked at him. "This is a good kitchen," she said. "It's been very lonely, but it's a good kitchen." Thomas wasn't sure what to say to that. He'd never thought of a kitchen as lonely before. He'd never thought of a kitchen as anything. "I'll put your things in the room at the end of the hall," he said. "It gets the morning light." She looked at him for a moment. "Thank you," she said. And she meant it not in the polished, automatic way of politeness, but in the way of someone who doesn't offer words unless they're carrying weight. He set her suitcase down in the hallway and went back outside. He stood on the porch for a moment. He didn't know what he'd expected. He knew it hadn't been that. That evening, Thomas ate supper alone at the kitchen table, the same as always. He'd told Eleanor there was bread and cold meat in the pantry, that she should help herself, that he didn't expect her to start cooking that night. She thanked him. He went out to check on the cattle. When he came back, the kitchen smelled like something he hadn't smelled in 6 years. It smelled like a meal. Not just food. Not just something cooked because hunger demanded it. It smelled like someone had thought about what would be warm and filling after a long day, and then had made that specifically. Eleanor was setting 2 plates on the table. Thomas stopped in the doorway. "I found potatoes and onions in the root cellar," she said without looking up. "And there was salt pork in the pantry. I hope that's all right." "You didn't have to." "I know I didn't have to." She set down 2 cups of coffee. "Sit down, it'll get cold." He sat down. He ate. He'd had salt pork and potatoes 1,000 times in his life. He knew what that tasted like. He knew it the way he knew what fence posts tasted like, which was to say it was fuel and nothing else. This was not that. He didn't know what she'd done differently. He wasn't a man who could explain food. But every bite was something he hadn't expected the next one to be, and when the plate was empty, he was genuinely surprised that it was. He looked up. Eleanor was eating her own supper, looking out the dark window, her notebook open beside her plate. She was writing something between bites, unhurried, the way a person does something they've done so often it doesn't require thought. "That was good," Thomas said. She looked up. "Thank you," she said, and she meant that too. He watched her for a moment. "What are you writing?" She looked down at the notebook. Her hand covered the page just slightly, not aggressively, but the way a person moves their hand over something private without quite deciding to. "Notes," she said. "About what?" A pause. "Things I don't want to forget," she said. He nodded. He didn't ask again, but he looked at that notebook for a moment longer than was casual before he got up and carried his plate to the sink. The next morning he was up before light the way he always was. He didn't expect Eleanor to be up. She was already in the kitchen. She had coffee made. Not for him specifically, he could see that. She'd made it because she was up, and coffee was what you made when you were up. But there was enough for two. He poured a cup without saying anything. She was looking out of the morning window, the one she'd called good light the day before. The sky was just starting to separate from the land, that dark gray pulling back to show the first edge of color. He stood beside the stove and drank his coffee. She stood at the window and drank hers. Neither of them said anything for a good 5 minutes. He didn't know when the last time was that he'd shared a silence with someone that didn't feel like something was missing from it. He finished his coffee, set the cup in the sink. "I'm going to check the east fence line this morning," he said. "Crew comes in at 7. "I'll have breakfast ready before they arrive," she said. He nodded. He put on his coat and went out into the dark. He paused once just beyond the porch for no particular reason. Then he kept walking. By the end of the first week, Thomas's foreman Joe Briggs had formed an opinion. Joe Briggs was a man who had opinions the way some men had hats. He had a lot of them, and he wore them constantly, and he didn't understand why anyone would go without. He found Thomas mending a section of fence on Wednesday afternoon. "Your wife," Joe said without preamble. "She's not my wife yet," Thomas said, not looking up. The agency arrangement included a 3-month period before any formal decision was made. He'd explained that to Eleanor on the second day. She'd said that seems reasonable and gone back to whatever she was doing. "You're whatever she is," Joe said. "She asked me this morning how much weight the south pasture can carry in wet season." Thomas straightened up. "What'd you tell her?" "I told her what I know. Then she told me something I didn't." Joe pushed his hat back on his head. "She said the drainage pattern off the ridge is running toward the southwest corner, and we're going to have standing water there by August if we don't redirect it." Thomas looked at him. "She said that." "She drew me a picture in the dirt." Joe paused. "She was right. I've been watching that corner go soft for 3 summers, and I never put together why." Thomas went back to the fence. He drove a nail. "Joe," he said. "Yeah. Don't go making more of it than it is." Joe was quiet for a moment. "I'm not making anything out of it," he said. "I'm just telling you what happened." He walked back toward the barn. Thomas stood with his hammer. He thought about Eleanor in the dirt drawing drainage lines with a stick. He went back to the fence. The first real trouble came at the end of week 2. One of the ranch hands, a young man named Corey, who'd been on the property 6 months and thought he knew more than he did, came into the kitchen while Eleanor was working. Thomas heard it from the yard. He heard Corey's voice, first loose and careless, the way young men get when they think nobody's listening who matters. "You really know how to cook, or you just putting on a show for him?" Thomas went still. He heard Eleanor's voice, even unhurried. "Hand me that pot from the top shelf." Didn't answer my question. "I don't answer questions that aren't worth answering." A pause. "The pot, please." A silence. Then the sound of a pot being set on the counter. "Yes, ma'am," Corey said. Thomas heard the boy's boots heading for the door. He stepped back before Corey came out, so it didn't look like he'd been standing there. But he stood in the yard for another moment after Corey walked past him toward the barn. He didn't know why exactly that exchange settled something in him. But it did. Two weeks became 4. The farmhouse changed in ways Thomas couldn't have itemized if asked to, but that he felt every time he walked through the door. It wasn't the curtains Eleanor had quietly replaced plain cotton practical, but not faded. It wasn't the organized shelves or the repaired garden out back that was already showing green despite the season. It was something less visible than any of that. The men stayed later after meals. That was the first thing he noticed. His crew were hard-working men who ate fast and went back to their business. That was the rhythm of a working farm. You ate, you went. But now they lingered. They refilled their coffee cups. They talked not about work, but about other things. Corey, who'd gotten quiet around Eleanor since the pot incident, had started telling stories about his younger brother back in Colorado that Thomas hadn't known existed. Old Pete, who'd worked the ranch for 3 years and spoken fewer total words than some fence posts, had told a long story about a horse he'd had as a boy. At Thomas's table, in Thomas's kitchen. Thomas sat at the head of that table one evening, watching all of it and trying to figure out when exactly it had started happening. Eleanor was refilling the bread basket. She caught his eye across the table. She didn't say anything. She just set the bread down and sat back in her chair. But there was something in the look, not satisfaction exactly, more like recognition, like she was watching him notice something she'd already seen coming. He looked away. He drank his coffee. He told himself again that this was a practical arrangement. He found the notebook. Not snooping. He needed to be clear about that, even just to himself. He wasn't the kind of man who went through other people's things. He'd been raised with a hard line about that, and he'd never crossed it. He found the notebook because it fell. Eleanor had left it on the kitchen table when she went out to the garden, and it was near the edge, and a draft from the window caught it, and it fell, and it landed open. He picked it up. He meant to close it. Instead, he read one line, just one, because the handwriting was large and clear, and his eyes caught it before his intention caught up. A kitchen is the first language a house speaks. If you learn it, you learn the house. He stood there with the open notebook in his hands. He didn't read further. He set it back on the table spine down same angle. He went outside. He stood on the porch. He thought about a kitchen being the first language a house speaks. He thought about his kitchen for the 6 years before Eleanor arrived. He didn't want to think about what language that had been. He went back to work. It was on a Thursday afternoon in the 5th week that Eleanor first showed him what she could really do. He'd been in the south pasture since morning with Joe, and 2 of the hands trying to diagnose why 3 of his best cattle had gone off feed. He'd been farming long enough to know that cattle off feed was the beginning of something, and the beginning of something with cattle could end a dozen different ways, none of them good. He came in at noon, frustrated and mud-tired, and with no answer. Eleanor had already heard. Word traveled fast on a small farm. She was at the kitchen table with a piece of paper covered in her handwriting. "Sit down," she said. "I need to get back out there. Sit down for 10 minutes. He sat down. She pushed the paper across the table. He looked at it. It was a list, not a short one. It covered the cattle's symptoms, which she'd gotten somehow from Joe, or from her own observation, he didn't know. And then beneath that, 7 possible causes, listed in order of likelihood, with notes beside each one about what to look for, to confirm or rule it out. He read it twice. "Where did you?" he started. "Third item on that list," she said. "Look at their eyes and their gums. If it's what I think it is, there's a plant that comes up along the creek bank in late spring. Cattle eat it sometimes if the grass is thin." He looked at her. "My grandfather had the same problem," she said, simply, like it was just information. "We lost 4 before we figured it out." He looked back at the list. He stood up. "I'll check the creek bank," he said. He found the plant within the hour. That evening, after the affected cattle had been moved and treated, Thomas sat in the kitchen with the last of the day's coffee and Eleanor's list still on the table in front of him. Eleanor came in from outside. She looked at the list. She looked at him. "You knew exactly what it was," he said. "I suspected. Why didn't you say something this morning?" She sat down across from him. "Because you didn't ask me," she said. "And because I'm new here. You have a crew that respects you. I wasn't going to walk into the middle of that and tell you your business in front of your men." Thomas looked at her for a long time. "That was your business too," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "I wasn't sure you saw it that way yet," she said. He didn't have an answer for that. He stood up. He carried his cup to the sink. At the doorway he stopped. "Eleanor." She looked up. "Thank you," he said. She held his look. "You're welcome, Thomas," she said. He went to bed. He lay in the dark for a long time. He thought about the letter he'd written in February, the practical, no romance, no expectations letter. He thought about the person he'd written it for, the simple, quiet woman who'd fit neatly into the empty space in his house. He thought about Eleanor at the kitchen table with her piece of paper covered in careful handwriting. He thought about a kitchen is the first language a house speaks. He thought about his kitchen. He thought about the way it sounded now in the evenings with the crew's voices and the clink of cups and the smell of real food, and Eleanor's quiet presence moving through all of it like a thread that had been missing from the pattern. He stared at the ceiling. "I did not get what I ordered," he thought. "Then I got something I didn't know how to order." He didn't sleep for a long time. The 6th week brought the first real conversation. Not questions about the farm, not logistics, not the careful, functional exchange of two people working out how to share a house. A real conversation. It happened late after the crew had gone. After the dinner things were cleared, when the house was quiet enough that you could hear the wind off the north ridge moving around the barn the way Eleanor had calculated it would. Thomas was sitting on the porch. He didn't know why Eleanor came out. She just did the way she did things, without announcement, without asking if she was welcome, without fuss. She sat in the other chair, the one that had been empty for 6 years. They were quiet for a while. Then Eleanor said, "Tell me about her." Thomas's hands tightened on his coffee cup. He didn't ask who. He knew who. He was quiet for long enough that it would have been perfectly reasonable to let the question go unanswered. Then he said, "Clara." "Yes." He was quiet again. "She hated winter," he said finally. "She'd say it every year in October like it was new information, like I didn't know." A pause. "She'd start making quilts in September, before the cold even came. She'd have them finished by November and spend the whole winter under one whether it was cold enough or not." Eleanor didn't say anything. She let him keep going or not, whichever he chose. "She liked this porch," he said. "She liked the evenings. She used to say this was the best hour of the day, the one right before dark." He stopped. He turned his cup in his hands. "She was sick for 2 winters before she died. By the time she was gone..." He stopped again. "I'd said goodbye so many times in my head that when it actually happened, I didn't have anything left to say." The wind moved through the grass. Eleanor said quietly, "I think that's one of the hardest things. When grief comes in installments, you don't get to mourn it all at once." He looked at her. "Yeah," he said. "That's it exactly." He wasn't sure anyone had ever said that out loud before. He wasn't sure he'd been able to put it into words himself. They sat for a little while longer. The light finished going. Eleanor stood up. "Good night, Thomas," she said. "Good night." She went inside. He sat on the porch alone. He thought, "I have been alone for 6 years, and I never noticed how loud alone was until recently." He sat there until the stars came out. Then he went inside too. The house was quiet. But it was a different kind of quiet than it had been. He noticed that. He noticed it clearly enough that he stopped in the hallway and stood with it for a moment. Then he went to bed, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he fell asleep without reaching for the silence to fill the space where another person used to be. It was already filled. He just hadn't let himself see it until now. The morning after the porch conversation, Thomas woke up and did something he hadn't done in 6 years. He made 2 cups of coffee. He didn't think about it. His hand just reached for the second cup, the way it reached for the first, automatic and unhesitating, like his body had made a decision his mind hadn't caught up to yet. He stood at the stove with both cups in his hands and looked at them for a moment. Then he set one on the table where Eleanor usually sat. He went out to check the cattle. When he came back 20 minutes later, the cup was empty, and Eleanor was at the window with her notebook writing in it the way she always did, unhurried like the words knew where they were going and just needed her hand to carry them there. She didn't mention the coffee. He didn't either. But something had shifted between the night before and that morning, and they both knew it, and neither of them was ready to say what it was out loud. That was all right. Some things needed time before they had names. Joe Briggs noticed before anyone else did. Joe always noticed things first. It was part of what made him a good foreman, and occasionally an insufferable human being. He found Thomas in the barn on a Monday morning, 2 days after the porch conversation, checking over a section of harness that didn't especially need checking. "You look different," Joe said. "I look the same as I always look," Thomas said, not turning around. "You look like a man who slept recently." Thomas didn't answer. Joe leaned against the stall door. "She fixed the drainage problem in the south corner." Thomas turned around then. "What do you mean she fixed it?" "I mean she went out there with a shovel on Saturday while you were in town." Joe tilted his head. "Dug a redirect channel, 40 feet of it, by herself." He paused. "I found out when Pete mentioned it at breakfast. Said he offered to help and she told him she had it." Thomas set down the harness. "She didn't say anything to me." "No," Joe said. "She didn't." Thomas stood with that for a moment. Why didn't Pete help her anyway? Joe almost smiled. He said she had a way of declining help that made a man feel like the help was the problem. Thomas put on his coat. "Where's the channel?" "Southwest corner. You'll see it." He found it exactly where Eleanor had drawn it in the dirt 2 weeks earlier. 40 feet of clean, precise excavation, redirecting the drainage exactly as she'd said it needed to go. The edges were clean. The grade was right. It would work. He stood over it for a long time. He tried to imagine her out here alone with a shovel, methodical and quiet, doing what needed doing because it needed doing, not because anyone had asked, not because she was trying to prove something, just because it was the right thing for the land. He walked back to the farmhouse. Eleanor was in the kitchen. He stood in the doorway. "The southwest channel," he said. She looked up from what she was doing, waited. "You should have told me. You were in town. I would have helped." She looked at him steadily. "I know you would have, but I knew how to do it and I had time to do it. So I did it." "It's 40 feet of digging." "Yes," she said. "It is." He looked at her. "You didn't have to do that alone," he said. "Thomas." She set down what she was holding. "I've been doing things alone for a long time. I'm not fragile." He knew that. He'd known it since the first 40 seconds she'd stood on his property and asked about the water supply. "I know you're not fragile," he said. "That's not what I meant." She waited. He wasn't sure exactly what he'd meant. He stood there trying to find the words for it, which was not a thing he was particularly good at. "I meant." He stopped. Started again. "You don't have to do everything alone anymore." The kitchen was very quiet. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "All right," she said finally. "Just that. All right." He nodded. He went back outside, but he was almost certain in the half-second before he turned away that something moved across her face that she wasn't quite ready for him to see. The recipe notebook made its second appearance on a Wednesday. Thomas came inside at midday to find Eleanor at the kitchen table with the notebook open in front of her, and 3 other books spread around it. Old agricultural texts, the kind with cracked spines and pages that didn't lie flat anymore. She was cross-referencing something, her pen moving between her notes and the printed pages with the focused intensity of a person solving a problem that actually mattered. He almost asked. He got himself water instead and stood at the sink. "The bread starter's been slow," Eleanor said without looking up. "I didn't notice." "You wouldn't. It's still good bread, but it should be better. She turned a page. It's the water. The mineral content is different here than what I'm used to. I'm adjusting the ratio. He looked at her over his cup. You're adjusting a bread recipe for water minerals. Yes. That's... He stopped. What? He wasn't sure what it was. He'd been going to say that's a lot of effort for bread, but standing there in the kitchen, with the smell of that morning's loaves still in the air, he couldn't quite make the sentence come out. Nothing, he said. She gave him a brief sideways look that told him she knew exactly what he'd been going to say, and she'd decided not to push it. He sat down across from her. He watched her work. After a moment he said, "That notebook. How old is it?" Her pen paused. "The recipes in it go back 3 generations, she said. Your family's, my grandmother's mostly, then my mother's, then mine." She turned a page carefully the way you turn pages in something that matters. "My grandmother came to this country from Ireland with almost nothing. She had her recipes written on whatever paper she could find, flour sacks, margins of newspapers. My mother recopied them all into this book." Thomas looked at the notebook. "She must have been something," he said. "She fed 40 people a day out of a kitchen the size of this one," Eleanor said, "and she never charged anyone who couldn't pay." He was quiet for a moment. "What happened?" he said. "To your family?" Eleanor's pen stilled. She closed the notebook. Not abruptly, just decisively, the way a person closes something they're not ready to open all the way. "That's a longer story," she said. "And the bread needs checking." She got up. He let it go. But he looked at the closed notebook on the table and thought about flour sacks and newspaper margins and a woman who fed 40 people without asking whether they could pay. He thought about the letter Eleanor had written him. "I do not expect a fairy tale. I expect honesty, and I will give you the same." He thought about all the things that kind of honesty usually cost a person. He went back to work. The dinner that changed everything happened on a Friday evening in the 7th week. It was Eleanor's doing, though she hadn't planned it as anything significant. She'd simply made too much food. The crew had been working long hours on a fence repair that ran 2 days over schedule, and she'd expanded the meal to match, and somewhere between the expansion and the actual cooking, it had become something else. By the time the crew came in from the fields, there were 6 men at Thomas's table instead of the usual 4. 2 neighboring farmers, Hal Dexter and his son from the property 2 miles east, had stopped by in the afternoon about a boundary question, and Eleanor had said simply, "Stay for supper," and Hal, who had been eating his own cooking since his wife passed 4 years ago, had said yes before he'd finished deciding. The table was full in a way it had never been in Thomas's memory. Not just full of people, full of sound. The particular sound of people who weren't trying to fill silence, but who were generating it naturally without effort, because they were comfortable and fed and in a room that felt like it wanted them there. Hal was talking about a horse he'd had in his younger days, some legendary animal with a personality problem and an inexplicable ability to open every gate on the property. His son was laughing. Old Pete was adding details from a similar horse he'd known, and somehow the 2 stories had merged into a single increasingly improbable tale that was getting louder by the minute. Thomas sat at the head of the table. He looked down the length of it. Eleanor was at the other end cutting bread, not talking but listening with that particular quality of attention she had, the kind that made people feel heard without her saying a word. She glanced up and caught him looking. He held her gaze for a second. She passed the bread to Hal's son without breaking it. Hal turned to Thomas across the noise of the table and said, not lowering his voice enough, "Where'd you find her, Tom? Because I've been writing to that agency for 2 years, and they keep sending me women who want to know if I have a parlor." The table got slightly quieter. Thomas said, "I wrote them what I needed." Hal said, "And they sent you what you needed." Thomas looked at Eleanor. She was looking at him now, openly waiting the way she always waited, without pressure, without performance, just presence. "No," Thomas said. "They sent me something better." The table went back to its noise. Eleanor looked down at the bread in her hands. But he saw it this time, clearly the thing that had moved across her face weeks ago, and that he'd been too slow to catch. It was something she'd been protecting. Something she wasn't sure she was allowed to have. He looked at his plate. He thought, I'm going to have to do something about this sooner than I was planning. The next morning, Saturday, Thomas did something he hadn't done since before Clara got sick. He took the day off. Not completely, there was no such thing as a complete day off on a working farm, but he told Joe to handle the crew. He left the fence inventory until Monday, and instead of eating breakfast fast and going out, he sat at the kitchen table with his second cup of coffee and simply stayed there. Eleanor came in from the garden at 7:30 with mud on her boots and her hair coming loose and a look of mild surprise when she found him still inside. "You're not working," she said. "I'm working on my coffee." She went to wash her hands. She came back and poured her own cup and stood at the counter, not sitting the way she sometimes did when she was deciding something. "I want to ask you something," Thomas said. She waited. "What did you do before?" A pause. "What do you mean?" "Before the agency, before the letter, before Montana." He turned his cup in his hands. "You know how to drain a pasture. You adjusted a bread recipe for mineral content in the water. You diagnosed my cattle from a description. You know agricultural texts well enough to cross-reference them for your own notes." He looked up at her. "That's not just someone who grew up on a farm. What did you do, Eleanor?" The kitchen was quiet. Eleanor set down her cup. She didn't reach for the notebook. She didn't close anything down. She just stood there for a moment making some internal decision that he could almost see happening behind her eyes. "My family had a business," she said. "What kind of business?" "It started as a restaurant, my grandmother's." She came and sat down across from him, not the careful, measured sitting of someone settling in, but the deliberate movement of someone deciding to stop standing. "My mother grew it into something larger, supply and production. We grew food preserved. It distributed it to restaurants and hotels in 3 states. By the time I was 20, I was managing the purchasing accounts and learning the agricultural side." Thomas was very still. "That's a significant operation," he said. It was. He heard the was. "What happened to it?" She looked at the table. "My father had a partner," she said. "A man named Aldridge. He'd been with the business from almost the beginning. My father trusted him completely." She was quiet for a moment. "He shouldn't have." Thomas waited. "Aldridge had been falsifying the accounts for 4 years. By the time we found out, there was nothing left to save. The business was gone. My parents' property went with it to settle the debts." She looked up. "My mother died 6 months later. My father—" She stopped. "My father is still alive, but he's not himself anymore. He lives with my sister in Ohio." "I'm sorry," Thomas said. "It was 2 years ago," she said in the tone of someone who has said, "It's been 2 years ago" many times without that making it feel like 2 years ago. "That's why you came west," he said. "I needed to go somewhere that wasn't what that was." She looked at him steadily. "I wasn't running away. I want to be clear about that. I was choosing forward instead of backward." He looked at her. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said. "When you arrived, why not just say, 'This is who I am, this is what I know'?" She was quiet for a moment. "Because I was afraid," she said. He hadn't expected that word from her. He'd heard her decline help correct a grown man about drainage-diagnosed cattle, and tell a ranch hand his question wasn't worth answering. Afraid didn't fit the image. "Of what?" he said. "That you'd only see the usefulness," she said. "That you'd look at what I could do for the farm, and that would be all there was. And She stopped, started again. "I didn't want to be useful again, Thomas. Not just useful. I wanted to be somewhere that I was more than what I could provide." The kitchen was completely quiet. Thomas looked at her for a long time. He thought about the letter he'd written. "I require reliability." He thought about the list of qualities he'd put down like a man ordering parts for a machine. He thought about the word useful and all the cold mechanical space that word contained when it was the whole sentence. "Eleanor," he said. She looked at him. You were never just useful, he said. Not for one day. She looked down at the table. Her hands were flat on the surface. Thomas watched her take that in, watched her let it go somewhere inside her, instead of deflecting it, or qualifying it, or holding it at arm's length. Then she looked up. Thank you, she said. 2 words. The same 2 words she'd used for the coffee that first morning, and for the room with the good light, and for the compliment on the supper she'd made from salt pork and potatoes. But they were a different weight now. He heard the difference. The trouble came on a Tuesday. Not the slow kind of trouble that builds and gives a man time to prepare. The kind that arrives all at once and expects you to deal with it immediately. Thomas came in from the north pasture at midday to find a wagon outside his house that he didn't recognize, and a man standing on his porch he'd never seen before. The man was wearing a coat that cost more than Thomas's best horse. He had the kind of stillness that money buys the particular ease of a man who has never had to hurry toward anything because everything he wanted eventually came to him. He turned when Thomas came up the steps. Mr. Whitaker, he said. My name is Richard Caldwell. I'm sorry to arrive unannounced. He wasn't sorry. Thomas could tell that immediately. The apology was a formality he deployed the way other men deployed handshakes. What can I do for you, Mr. Caldwell? Thomas said. Not a question. A boundary. I'm actually here about your... A deliberate pause. Your arrangement. With Miss Hayes. Thomas went very still. I don't know what arrangement you're referring to, he said. Eleanor Hayes, Caldwell said. She arrived here approximately 7 weeks ago through the Weston Marriage Agency. Another pause, this one longer. I know Eleanor, Mr. Whitaker. We have a history. Behind Thomas, the front door opened. He heard Eleanor's voice, quiet and exactly level. Richard? He turned. She was in the doorway. Her face was composed with the careful composure of someone who needs composure in order to function. Caldwell looked at her. Something moved across his face, not warmth, not guilt. Something more calculating than either. Eleanor, he said. You look well. Montana agrees with you. What are you doing here? She said. I have business in this territory. Several land acquisitions I'm managing. He gestured vaguely. I heard through a contact in Cutter's Creek that a woman matching your description had arrived. I thought I'd confirm it. He tilted his head. I was surprised, after everything, that you'd come all the way out here to... He looked at Thomas. To start over so quietly. The word quietly landed like something thrown. I think... Thomas said that you should say what you came to say, Mr. Caldwell. Caldwell looked at him with the eyes of a man recalibrating. Of course, he said. I came to say hello to an old acquaintance, and perhaps to have a conversation about the future of this valley. He looked around at the farm with an appraiser's eyes. You have significant holdings here, Mr. Whitaker. Excellent land. A man in your position might find certain business arrangements very favorable in the coming years. I'm not interested in business arrangements, Thomas said. You haven't heard the arrangement. I don't need to. Caldwell smiled the kind of smile that doesn't have anything warm in it. Well, he said, I'll be in the area for some time. You may change your mind. He looked at Eleanor one more time. It was good to see you, Eleanor. I hope your situation here is everything you were hoping for. He climbed back into his wagon. Thomas stood on the porch and watched him drive away. He did not move until the wagon was out of sight. Then he turned to Eleanor. She was leaning against the doorframe with her arms crossed over her chest, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she looked like she was working hard at keeping herself together. Who is he? Thomas said. He was a business associate of my father's, she said. Before Aldridge. Thomas looked at her. How does he know you're here? Someone told him. She shook her head. He has contacts everywhere. He's the kind of man who collects information the way other men collect land. She looked at Thomas. He's not here just to say hello. No, Thomas said. He's not. He looked out in the direction the wagon had gone. "What does he want?" he said. "I don't know yet," Eleanor said. She said it quietly, but underneath the quiet was something else. The sound of a woman who had learned to recognize the beginning of something dangerous and who was already thinking 3 steps ahead. Thomas looked back at her. "Eleanor," he said. She met his eyes. "Whatever he's here for," Thomas said. "He came to the wrong farm." She held his gaze. Something in her steadied. She nodded once. "Yes," she said. She went back inside. Thomas stood on the porch for another moment. He thought about Caldwell's coat, and Caldwell's smile, and Caldwell's careful way of dropping words like they were small weights placed precisely to see what they'd tip over. He thought about Eleanor's father. He thought about a man named Aldridge who had falsified accounts for 4 years while a family trusted him. He thought about the way Eleanor had said he collects information, the way other men collect land, with the particular weariness of someone who has been a piece of information someone else collected. He went inside. He sat down at the kitchen table. Eleanor was at the counter, her back to him, her hands moving through the motions of preparing something, but her shoulders carried a tension that her hands were working to contradict. "Tell me about him," Thomas said. "All of it." She stopped. She turned around. She looked at him for a long moment, the same look she'd given him on the first day when he'd asked if she could handle farm life. The look of a person deciding how much of the truth the situation deserved. "Caldwell came to my father 3 years ago," she said. "He wanted a partnership, access to our distribution network in exchange for capital." She came and sat down. "My father was cautious about him. My mother was more cautious than that." She paused. "But Aldridge vouched for him, and my father trusted Aldridge." Thomas waited. "We found out after the collapse that Aldridge and Caldwell had planned it together from the beginning," she said. "Aldridge falsified the books. Caldwell was positioned to acquire the assets when the business went under." She looked at Thomas. "He got what he wanted. Everything but the recipes." Thomas looked at her. "He wanted your grandmother's recipes. He wanted the business," she said. "The recipes were part of the business. They were what made us distinctive. What other restaurants and hotels came to us for?" She looked at her hands. "He never got them because my mother hid the notebook before the creditors arrived. She knew what it was worth. She gave it to me the day before she died." Thomas sat with that for a moment, a dying woman handing her daughter a leather notebook. "And now he's here," he said. "And now he's here," she said. "Do you think he followed you?" "I think he found out I was here and decided it was convenient." She looked up. "He said he has land acquisitions in the territory. That may be true. Caldwell usually tells the truth about his business. It's his methods he keeps quiet." Thomas looked at her. "What does he want from you specifically?" Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "He made me an offer once," she said, "after the collapse. He said he could set me up in business again, a restaurant, a proper one, with the full backing of his capital, if I would share the family recipes and help establish the menu." She paused. "He called it an opportunity." "What did you tell him?" "I told him he could—" She stopped. A brief, genuine flicker of something that was almost humor moved across her face. "I told him the answer was no." Thomas almost smiled. "Good," he said. "He didn't take it as a final answer," she said. "Men like Caldwell don't hear no as final. They hear it as a negotiating position." Thomas looked at the table. He thought about the land acquisitions. He thought about Caldwell's eyes moving over his property with that appraiser's calculation. "He's not just here for the recipes," Thomas said. "No." Eleanor agreed. "He's not." They looked at each other across the kitchen table. The same table where Thomas had written a letter in February asking for something practical and simple. The same table where Eleanor had written notes between bites on the first night. The same table where a cup of coffee had appeared that morning without anyone deciding to put it there. The same table where 2 people who had each come to Montana carrying the weight of everything they'd lost were now sitting on the same side of something that hadn't declared itself yet. "All right," Thomas said. She raised her eyes. "Here's what we're going to do," he said. "We're going to find out exactly what he's after, what land he's looking at, and who he's talking to in town. And then we're going to be 3 steps ahead of whatever he's planning before he knows we're moving." Eleanor looked at him. "You don't have to get involved in this," she said. "This is my problem. It came with me." Eleanor. He leaned forward slightly. "You dug 40 feet of drainage channel on my land and didn't tell me because the job needed doing and you had time to do it." He held her gaze. "So don't sit there and tell me your problem is yours alone when you're sitting at my table in my kitchen on my farm." She stared at him. "That's—" she started. "What?" She stopped. She looked at him for a long moment. "That's a very unfair argument," she said. "It's the only one I have," he said. "Is it wrong?" She pressed her lips together. "No," she said. "It's not wrong." He nodded. He stood up. "I'm going to talk to Joe," he said. "He knows everyone in a 30-mile radius, and he hears things before they've finished being said. If Caldwell is making moves in this territory, Joe will have started hearing about it already." He went to the door. "Thomas." He turned. Eleanor was still sitting at the table. She was looking at him the way she'd looked at him across the full dinner table when Hal Dexter had asked his question openly, without the careful reserve she usually kept in place. "Thank you," she said. 3rd time today, his mind registered. But he didn't say that. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "We don't know what we're dealing with." He went out. The screen door closed behind him. Eleanor sat alone in the kitchen. She looked at the table, at the 2 empty coffee cups. She reached for the notebook. She opened it. She didn't write anything new. She just sat with it open in her hands, the way a person holds something that is both evidence of everything they've lost and everything they still have. Then she closed it. She got up. There was bread to make, supper to start. A full house of hungry men coming in from the fields in 4 hours. She pulled her sleeves back. She got to work. Because that was what you did. You got to work. And if trouble was coming, you made sure your house was in order before it arrived. Joe came back from town on Wednesday with the look of a man who had heard more than he'd gone looking for. Thomas saw it the moment Joe rode into the yard, the particular set of his shoulders that meant he was carrying something heavy and hadn't decided yet how to put it down. He waited until Joe had stabled his horse before he followed him into the barn. "Tell me," Thomas said. Joe hung up his bridle. He didn't rush it. "Caldwell's been in Cutter's Creek 3 days, he said. "Not at the boarding house. He's renting the Mercer property on the north end of town. The whole house." Thomas waited. "He's had meetings with 4 men that I know of," Joe said. "Haskell at the land registry office, Pearson at the bank, Judge Dorsey." He paused. "And Martin Cole." Thomas felt something cold settle in his chest. Martin Cole was the largest landowner in the valley outside of Thomas himself. He was also the man who sat on the Territorial Land Commission, which handled every dispute, every contested claim, every transfer of property in a 100-mile radius. "What's Cole meeting with him about?" Thomas said. "Nobody knows for certain," Joe said. "But here's what I do know." He finally turned around. 3 months ago, before any of us had ever heard of Richard Caldwell, 2 smaller farms on the east side of the valley were sold. Brewster's Place and the Hansen claim. I knew about those sales. Did you know they were both sold at about 1/3 of their value? Thomas stared at him. "Brewster needed money fast," Joe said. "His wife was sick. Hansen's well went bad, and he couldn't afford to drill a new one." He crossed his arms. "Both of them sold to a land holding company called Pacific Meridian Properties." He looked at Thomas directly. "Pacific Meridian is Richard Caldwell." Thomas stood with that. "He's been buying up valley land," he said, "for 3 months, before he ever showed his face here." Joe's jaw was tight. "The well going bad on Hansen's place, I talked to the man who drilled the original well 3 years ago. He said that well was solid, good water table, no reason it should have failed." The cold in Thomas's chest spread. You're saying someone put it out of service, Thomas said. I'm saying it's a question worth asking, Joe said carefully. Thomas turned and looked out through the barn door toward the farmhouse. Eleanor was in the kitchen. He could see the light in the window. He came here 2 days after arriving in the territory. Thomas said more to himself than to Joe. He knew where she was before he got here, Joe said quietly. He didn't hear about her from a contact in town, Thomas. He came here because of her. Thomas turned back to him. Get me everything you can on Pacific Meridian, he said. Any public record, any filing at the land registry, anyone who'll talk. Already working on it, Joe said. Thomas nodded. He walked back to the house. He didn't tell Eleanor everything that night. He told himself it was because he needed to know more before he could be certain. He told himself it was because he didn't want to frighten her without cause. But the truth was simpler and less comfortable than that. He didn't tell her because he'd seen her face when Caldwell drove away, and he wasn't ready to put that look back on it until he had something more than suspicion to hand her alongside it. She noticed he was quiet at supper. After the crew left and she was clearing the table, she said without looking at him, "What did Joe find?" "Some things worth looking into," he said. She set down the plates she was carrying. She turned around. "Thomas?" He met her eyes. "I'm not someone you need to manage," she said. "If there's something I should know, tell me." He looked at her for a moment. Then he told her about Pacific Meridian. He told her about Brewster and Hanson, about the land registry meetings and the bank and Martin Cole. He told her about the well. He didn't embellish it. He didn't soften it. He laid it out the same way he'd lay out a field survey accurately, in order without editorializing. When he finished, Eleanor was very still. "He's been here 3 months, she said. Not a question. "Yes." "And he's already acquired 2 properties. "Yes." She turned and looked out the dark window. "He did the same thing in Pennsylvania," she said. "Before he approached my father. He spent 6 months acquiring smaller suppliers, the ones we depended on for materials and distribution. By the time he came to my father with a partnership offer, he already had us partially surrounded." Her voice was level, controlled. "We didn't see it until later. After." Thomas watched her. "He's methodical," he said. "He's patient," she said. "Which is worse." She turned back to him. "He doesn't rush. He sets up the position first. Then he offers what looks like a choice, but the choice is already decided by the time he offers it." Thomas thought about Caldwell on his porch. "You may change your mind." "What does he want with this valley?" Thomas said. "Water," Eleanor said immediately. He looked at her. "The water rights," she said. "That's what the East Valley land means. The Brewster property and the Hanson claim both sit on the eastern tributary of Cutter's Creek." She looked at him with the focused clarity of someone whose mind had already moved several steps down the board. If someone controls the upstream water rights on the eastern tributary, they have leverage over every farm that irrigates from the creek downstream. Thomas sat down slowly. He ran through the geography in his head. She was right. "That's half the valley," he said. "More than half," she said, "including your land." The kitchen was very quiet. "And the notebook," Thomas said. She nodded. "If he can get the water rights and the recipes, both he can build what he tried to build in Pennsylvania here instead." She sat down across from him. "A distribution operation, agricultural supply, and premium food production. He'll offer the valley farmers a deal sell to him or be cut off from the water, and he'll use the recipes to establish the commercial value of the food operation." Thomas looked at her. "You figured all of that out in 5 minutes, he said. "I figured it out in 5 minutes because I watched him do it before," she said. "I knew the shape of it the moment you told me about the Hanson well." He held her gaze. "What do we do?" he said. She hadn't expected him to ask it that way. He could see that. She'd been prepared to make a case to argue for involvement, to convince him this was worth fighting. The directness of the question stopped her for just a second. "We move faster than he does," she said. "How?" "He needs the land registry to finalize anything. He needs Cole on the commission to approve any large-scale water rights transfer. She leaned forward. If we can get to the other valley landowners before he makes his offer, if we can show them what Pacific Meridian is and what his strategy is, he loses the quiet that he needs to operate. He'll know we're doing it, Thomas said. Yes, she said. He will. And that will make him move faster. Yes, she said again. It will. They looked at each other. All right, Thomas said. The Valley meeting happened on Friday. Thomas called it the way ranchers called things. In that country he rode to each neighboring property himself and said, "Come to my place Friday evening. There's something you need to hear." He didn't explain more than that. Men who'd known him for years came, because Thomas Whitaker didn't call meetings, which meant, when he did it, mattered. 7 men came. Hal Dexter was the first to arrive. 2 brothers named Tanner, who ran the largest cattle operation on the western side. Old Gus Peterman, who'd been in the valley longer than anyone, and was generally regarded as its unofficial memory. 3 others from the South Range. They sat in Thomas's front room, which was too small for 7 large men, plus Thomas and Eleanor brought coffee and didn't hover, which the men appreciated. Thomas laid it out. He wasn't a speaker. He'd always left talking to Joe when talking was needed. But this he did himself steadily and without decoration. Pacific Meridian, the 2 acquisitions, the water rights, the pattern Eleanor had identified. He didn't mention Eleanor by name in the first part. He didn't need to. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Hal Dexter said, "The Hanson well." "Yes," Thomas said. "I always thought that was strange," Hal said slowly. "Ed Hanson's well was as good a well as I've seen sunk in this valley." "Somebody put it out," said one of the Tanner brothers. "We can't prove that," Thomas said. "Not yet." "How'd you put all this together?" old Gus Peterman said. He was looking at Thomas with the particular sharp attention of a man who has been around long enough to know when someone has had help. Thomas looked at the doorway where Eleanor had appeared with the coffee pot. "Eleanor put it together," he said. Every man in the room looked at her. She stood there with the coffee pot and met the combined weight of 7 sets of eyes without blinking. "He ran the same operation in Pennsylvania 3 years ago," she said. "I know because my family was on the receiving end of it." She came into the room and refilled cups without asking. "He's patient, and he's quiet, and he's already positioned himself with the Land Commission. If you want to stop him, you have about 2 weeks before he starts making offers that look like opportunities." "How do you know 2 weeks?" Gus said. "Because the Brewster and Hanson acquisitions finalized 3 weeks ago," she said. "And the Eastern Tributary Water Rights petition typically takes 4 to 6 weeks to process at the land registry." She looked at him levelly. "He filed it 2 weeks ago." Dead silence. Thomas watched the room absorb that. "He's already filed," Hal said. "Yes," Eleanor said. "How do you know that?" one of the Tanner brothers said, not hostile, genuinely asking. "Because I went to the land registry this morning and looked," she said. Thomas turned to look at her. She hadn't told him that. She met his eyes briefly, a look that said, "I was going to tell you, I just hadn't yet," and then went back to the room. "The filing is public record," she said. "Anyone can see it, which means anyone can contest it if they have standing." She looked around the room. "Every man here who irrigates from the Eastern Tributary has standing." Gus Peterman leaned back in his chair and studied Eleanor Hayes with the full weight of 40 years of reading people. "Young woman," he said, "what exactly is your stake in this?" "He destroyed my family's business," she said. "And he followed me out here, which means he either wants something I have, or he wants to make sure I can't build something that competes with him." She looked at Gus steadily. "Both of those things make him my problem. And since he's also making plans that would put every man in this room at his mercy, it seems like we have matching interests." Gus looked at Thomas. "Where'd you find her?" he said. "Weston Marriage Agency," Thomas said. Gus let out a sound that was approximately a laugh. The next 10 days moved faster than anything Thomas had managed in years. Joe coordinated with the Valley men. Thomas drafted statements contesting the water rights petition. Eleanor wrote the actual language, because her knowledge of how such documents needed to read was considerably better than anyone else in the valley. Hal Dexter rode to the county seat to file the first official contest. Caldwell wasn't idle. On the fourth day, he came back to Thomas's farm. This time, Thomas was ready for him. He met Caldwell at the gate before the man could reach the porch. Caldwell looked at the gate and then at Thomas and made a small adjustment to his expression. "Mr. Whitaker," he said, "I heard there was a meeting of valley landowners at your property Friday." "News travels fast," Thomas said. "It does," Caldwell said pleasantly. "I also heard there was a filing contest lodged against a perfectly routine water rights petition." He tilted his head. "I hope there's no misunderstanding about the nature of that petition." "There's no misunderstanding," Thomas said. "It's a standard infrastructure request," Caldwell said. "Water management for the eastern acreage I've acquired. Nothing that affects downstream." "Stop," Thomas said. Caldwell stopped. "You and I both know what that petition is," Thomas said. "So does every man in this valley now. So does the Land Commission, or it will by end of week." He held Caldwell's gaze. "You came to the wrong territory, Mr. Caldwell, and you came to the wrong farm." Something shifted in Caldwell's face just briefly, just for a moment. Beneath the pleasant surface, something cold and calculating did a rapid reassessment. Then the pleasant surface came back. "You've been talking to Eleanor," he said. "Miss Hayes," Thomas said. "Yes." "She has a history of mischaracterizing business arrangements," Caldwell said carefully. "In Pennsylvania, there were questions about her family's accounting practices that—" "Stop," Thomas said again, harder this time. Caldwell stopped again. "Whatever you're about to say about her," Thomas said, "don't." Caldwell looked at him with the eyes of a man recalibrating once more. "You've made a decision about her," he said. "I've made a decision about you," Thomas said, "which is that you're done here. Whatever you planned when you rode into this valley, it's done. The contest filing will hold. The other landowners have been informed, and if that well on Hanson's property turns out to have been tampered with, there are people in this county who will want to know by whom." Caldwell was very still. "That's a serious accusation," he said quietly. "I didn't accuse you of anything," Thomas said. "I said there are people who will want to know." A long silence. Caldwell looked past Thomas toward the farmhouse. Thomas shifted just slightly to keep himself between Caldwell and the house. It was an unconscious movement, but Caldwell noticed it. Something in his expression changed, something small but significant. A man recalculating not just strategy, but stakes. "Interesting," Caldwell said softly. "Ride out, Mr. Caldwell," Thomas said. Caldwell rode out. Thomas stood at the gate until the wagon disappeared. Then he turned back to the house. Eleanor was on the porch. She had her arms crossed and she'd been watching. "You heard," he said. "Most of it." "You should have told me about the land registry," he said. "I know," she said. "I went on impulse and I was going to tell you last night and then supper happened and I—" She stopped. "I should have told you. You're right." He walked up the steps. He stopped in front of her. "Don't do things alone anymore," he said. "Remember." She looked up at him. "I remember," she said. He nodded. He went inside. She stood on the porch a moment longer looking out in the direction Caldwell had gone. She didn't feel relieved. Men like Caldwell didn't retreat. They regrouped. She knew that. She went inside. The blow came from a direction neither of them expected. Not Caldwell. It came from the town of Cutter's Creek itself. On a Thursday morning 11 days after the Valley meeting, Eleanor went into town for supplies. Routine. She'd done it half a dozen times. She knew the shopkeepers knew the order of the stops, knew which side of the street got morning shade. She came back 2 hours later and Thomas knew before she said a word. She set the supplies on the kitchen table and stood with her back to him for a moment, that deliberate stillness of someone making sure they're composed before they turn around. She turned around. People are talking, she said. Thomas went still. Caldwell. I don't know if it was Caldwell directly, she said, but someone has been talking. She sat down. Her hands on the table were flat and controlled. Mrs. Haskell, the land registrar's wife, she barely spoke to me today. She's always spoken to me. She paused. At the dry goods, the conversation stopped when I walked in. Pearson at the bank was busy when I walked past. He's never been too busy to say good morning. Thomas sat down. What are they saying? He said. I only heard pieces, she said. But the shape of it is clear. She looked at him. Someone is saying I didn't come here honest, that I concealed who I was, that I have connections to failed business dealings back east. A pause. That I may have come west to get away from legal trouble. The kitchen was very quiet. There is no legal trouble, Thomas said. I know that, she said, but Caldwell doesn't need it to be true. He needs it to be doubted. Her voice was steady, perfectly carefully steady in the way of a person who has had practice controlling what they show. If people here doubt my character, they doubt what I've told the Valley men about him. They doubt the contest filing. They start wondering if Thomas Whitaker has been taken advantage of by a woman who showed up with a good story and a useful skill set. Thomas looked at her. Let them wonder, he said. Thomas, let them wonder, he said again. The people in this valley who know me know what I think of my own judgment, and the contest filing is backed by public record, not by your word alone. She looked at him for a long moment. He's trying to separate us, she said. Make you question me. Make the others question whether you've been manipulated. I know what he's doing, Thomas said. It might work, she said quietly. People talk. Stories spread. You've built something here over 14 years. Your reputation, your relationships with these men. She looked at the table. I don't want to be the reason any of that gets damaged. Thomas leaned forward. Eleanor, look at me. She looked up. He destroyed your family, Thomas said. He followed you out here. He poisoned a man's well to take his land. And now he's spreading lies about you in the town, where you've done nothing but work and help and make things better since the day you arrived. His voice was low and even. I have 14 years in this valley. I have relationships and a reputation because I earned them, and the men who know me know it. One man with money and bad intentions can't undo that with whispers. He held her gaze. And if anyone in this town wants to come to me and say they doubt you, they're welcome to come say it to my face. She stared at him. Something cracked very slightly, very briefly, in the careful composure she'd been maintaining. You can't fight my battles, she said. I'm not fighting your battles, he said. I'm standing next to you while you fight them. There's a difference. She blinked. She looked down at the table. When she looked up again, the crack had closed, but what was behind it had shifted. Something had moved in her that wasn't going back to where it was. Thomas, she said. What? Why are you doing this? He looked at her. He thought about what to say. He wasn't a man who reached for words easily. He'd said more in the past 7 weeks than he'd said in the previous 2 years combined, and some of it had surprised him on its way out of his mouth. This surprised him too. Because you're the first person in 6 years, he said, that I've made 2 cups of coffee for without deciding to. She was very still. He hadn't planned to say it, but it was true, and it was the most accurate thing he had, and he'd always preferred accuracy. She looked at him for a long time. That's a strange thing to say, she said. Yes, he agreed. But I understand what you mean, she said. I thought you might, he said. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then Eleanor took a breath that was slightly deeper than usual. We need to figure out who he's been talking to in town, she said. If he's been working through Pearson at the bank, there may be a money angle we haven't found yet. Joe can... I want to go to Gus Peterman, she said. He knows this valley the way I know those recipes. If anyone can trace where the talk started, it's him. Thomas nodded. Tomorrow morning, he said. Tomorrow morning, she agreed. She stood up and began putting away the supplies with the brisk efficiency of a woman who has decided the next step and is ready to take it. Thomas watched her for a moment. He thought about the letter he'd written in February. I require reliability. He almost laughed at himself for that. Reliability. As if that was the word for what was standing in his kitchen right now, organizing flour sacks with the focused precision of someone who was simultaneously planning 3 moves ahead in a fight against a man with more money and more patience than anyone in this valley. Reliability didn't begin to cover it. He got up. He went to find Joe. Gus Peterman, as it turned out, already knew everything. He met them at his kitchen table the next morning with coffee already poured, and the particular expression of a man who has been waiting for a conversation to arrive. I heard the talk started at the bank, he said before either of them could begin. Pearson's clerk has a loose mouth when he drinks. Word is Caldwell met with Pearson privately last week, and after that meeting, the clerk was overheard at the saloon saying there was something not right about the woman out at Whitaker's place. Eleanor's jaw was tight. What specifically? Thomas said. That she came out here under a false name, Gus said. That her real name is connected to a business collapse back east with investors who lost money. He looked at Eleanor. Is that true? My name is Eleanor Hayes, she said. My family's business collapsed because a man named Aldridge falsified accounts on behalf of Richard Caldwell. No investors lost money from anything my family did. Several investors lost money when Caldwell used the collapse to acquire assets below value. She looked at Gus. If there's a court record of anything connected to my family name, it will show my father filed a complaint against Aldridge that was partially upheld. We were the wronged party, not the wronging party. Gus looked at her steadily for a long moment. Then he looked at Thomas. She talked like this all the time, he said. Yes, Thomas said. Good, Gus said. He turned back to Eleanor. Because what you just described to me is called fraud, young woman. And fraud in a territorial land acquisition scheme is a federal matter, not a local one. The room went very still. Eleanor looked at Gus. Thomas looked at Gus. Say that again, Thomas said. If Caldwell manipulated a land transaction in Pennsylvania through fraudulent accounting, and if that same man is now acquiring land in a federal territory through potentially similar methods. Gus folded his hands on the table. That's not a matter for the local land commission. That's a matter for the federal land office. He paused. Which happens to have a representative in Helena who I've known for 15 years. Eleanor stared at him. You know a federal land commissioner, she said. His name is Frank Aldous, Gus said. We came west together in 1859. He went into law. I went into cows. He shrugged. We've kept in touch. Thomas looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at Thomas. The same thought moving between them at the same speed. How quickly can you reach him? Eleanor said. I can have a letter in Helena by Tuesday, Gus said. What would he need? Eleanor said. Documentation, Gus said. Evidence of the Pennsylvania operation. Evidence of the water rights petition here. Evidence of the Hanson well. He looked at Eleanor. And a witness who was present in Pennsylvania and can testify to the pattern. The word testify landed in the room like a stone into still water. Eleanor didn't move. Thomas watched her. He knew what that word meant for her. Going back into all of it. Telling the story of her family's collapse in a formal setting. Having her name and her mother's name and her grandmother's recipes pulled into a proceeding that Caldwell would fight with every resource he had. He waited. He didn't say anything. Because she didn't need him to say anything. She needed a moment to make the decision herself. She took the moment. Then she looked at Gus Peterman. What do I need to write down? She said. Gus reached into his coat. He pulled out a pen and several sheets of paper. He laid them in front of her. Start with Pennsylvania, he said. Start at the beginning. Eleanor picked up the pen. Her hand was perfectly steady. She started writing. Thomas sat beside her at the old man's table while the morning moved outside the windows and the coffee went cold, and Eleanor Hayes wrote out the full account of everything Richard Caldwell had taken from her family. Every falsified number, every manipulated sale, every step of the pattern she'd watched destroy everything her grandmother had built. She wrote for an hour and 20 minutes without stopping. When she finished, she set down the pen. She looked at what she'd written. Gus took the pages and read them carefully front to back, the way a man reads something he intends to act on. When he finished, he looked up. "This is enough," he said. "More than enough." He looked at both of them. "But you need to be ready for him to come back hard when he hears a federal inquiry has been opened. And he will hear. Men like Caldwell always hear." Thomas nodded. "Let him come," he said. Gus looked at Eleanor. "Young woman," he said, "I've been in this valley 30 years. I've seen men come in here and try to take what other people built. Sometimes they win." He tapped the pages. "But they usually win because the people they're taking from don't understand what's happening until it's too late." He held her gaze. "You understood what was happening before most men in this valley would have." Eleanor looked at him. She didn't deflect it. She didn't minimize it. She just said, "I learned from watching it happen once. I wasn't going to let it happen again." Gus nodded. He began preparing his letter to Helena. Thomas and Eleanor rode back to the farm in the late morning quiet side by side on the wagon seat, the valley spreading out around them in all directions. They didn't talk much on the ride. There wasn't much that needed saying right then. But at one point, Eleanor said, looking straight ahead at the road, "When this is done one way or the other, I want to stay." Thomas kept his eyes on the road, too. "I know," he said. "I haven't said that before," she said. "I know," he said again. "But I knew." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How?" He thought about 2 cups of coffee. About a kitchen that had been lonely and wasn't anymore. About a porch chair that had been empty for 6 years and wasn't anymore. About a silence that used to be loud and recently had started slowly to fill itself. "Same way you knew about the drainage," he said. "You pay attention long enough, you see where things are going." Eleanor looked at him then. He kept his eyes on the road. But he was almost certain she was smiling. He didn't look to confirm it. He didn't need to. He already knew. Gus's letter reached Helena in 4 days. Frank Aldis's reply came back in 6. Thomas was in the barn when Joe brought it out, and he knew from the weight of Joe's walk, that particular purposeful stride that meant something had changed, that it wasn't nothing. He took the letter. He read it standing there. Then he went to find Eleanor. She was in the kitchen garden, the one she'd brought back from years of neglect, and she was working with the focused quiet she brought to everything physical, unhurried, efficient, completely present. She heard him coming and looked up before he spoke. She read his face. "Good or bad?" she said. "Aldis is coming himself," Thomas said. "He'll be in Cutter's Creek in 10 days. He wants to meet with you with Gus and with anyone who can speak to the land transactions." Eleanor sat back on her heels. "He's taking it seriously," she said. "He's taking it very seriously," Thomas said. Gus's letter apparently wasn't the first thing he'd heard about Pacific Meridian. There were questions raised in 2 other territories about similar patterns. He paused. "We're not the first valley Caldwell has moved on." Eleanor was very still. "How many?" she said. "Aldis didn't say in the letter. He said he'll explain when he arrives." She stood up slowly. She was doing the thing she did when information arrived that required rapid internal processing. Her face went quiet, and her eyes went slightly distant, and you could almost see the pieces moving behind them. "He's been doing this systematically," she said. "Moving from territory to territory. Each time he gets pushed out or things get too complicated, he moves west." "That's what it looks like," Thomas said. "Which means he has practice at this," she said. "He knows how to respond when it starts going wrong." She looked at Thomas. He's going to move before Aldous gets here. Thomas nodded. That's what I think too. She looked at him. We have 10 days, she said. Yes, he said. Then we'd better not waste them, she said. She pulled off her gardening gloves. She went inside. Thomas stood in the garden for a moment, looking at the rose she'd brought back from nothing. The orderly green lines of something that had been abandoned and was now undeniably alive. He followed her inside. Caldwell moved on day 3, not toward Thomas, not toward Eleanor directly. He moved on the Valleymen. The first sign came from Hal Dexter, who rode over on a Wednesday morning looking like a man who hadn't decided how to feel about something yet. Thomas met him in the yard. Caldwell came to my place yesterday evening, Hal said without preamble. Thomas waited. He made me an offer, Hal said. For my property. What kind of offer? The kind that sounds generous until you think about it for more than 30 seconds. Hal took his hat off and turned it in his hands. He said the water situation in the valley was going to become complicated in the next few years, droughts, disputes, uncertainty. He said he was offering fair value now before things got difficult. He looked at Thomas. He was very calm about it, very reasonable sounding. But, Thomas said, but the price he offered was a third under what my place is worth, Hal said. And when I pointed that out, he said values were going to decline regardless, and this was protection against that. He paused. Then he said that some of the valley people had been influenced by bad information from individuals with unclear motives. He put his hat back on. I knew he meant Eleanor. Thomas kept his face even. What did you tell him? He said. I told him I'd think about it, Hal said, because I wanted to come tell you before I told him anything else. Thomas nodded. Did he go to anyone else? He said. Tanner Brothers, I heard, and old Pete Svensson on the South Range. Hal looked at him directly. Tom, a third of these men have margins that don't leave a lot of room, if Caldwell is patient enough and the pressure is right. I know, Thomas said. Is this federal business going to come through in time? Hal said. I don't know, Thomas said. Honestly, because he didn't. Hal nodded slowly. All right, Hal said. I'm not selling, I want you to know that. But I thought you should know he's moving. He rode out. Thomas went back inside. Eleanor was at the table with Gus's copy of the water rights petition and 3 other documents spread out in front of her. She'd been working on a formal response for Aldous, a detailed account that cross-referenced the Pennsylvania events with the Montana pattern in a way that any federal officer would understand immediately. She looked up. He told her what Hal had said. She didn't react the way he expected. She didn't look alarmed or angry. She picked up her pen and made a note on the edge of one of the documents. He's going to do the same thing he did in Pennsylvania, she said. Offer below value, frame it as protecting them, make it sound like the alternative is worse. She looked up. It won't work with men like Hal Dexter, but there will be someone it works on. Pete Svensson, Thomas said. His wife is sick. Medical bills. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. Of course, she said. She set down her pen. I need to go talk to Pete Svensson, she said. Eleanor? Not to tell him what to do, she said quickly. To make sure he knows what the offer actually is before he decides. She looked at Thomas. He deserves to make a real choice, not one Caldwell engineered. Thomas looked at her. I'll drive you, he said. You don't need to. I'll drive you, he said again. She looked at him for just a moment. All right, she said. Pete Svensson was a thin-weathered man who had been in the valley almost as long as Gus, and who wore the particular exhaustion of someone managing more than one hard thing at once. His wife Martha had been ill since winter. There were 2 grown children back east who sent money when they could. The farm was good land, but it didn't run itself, and a man managing a sick wife and a farm alone was a man with his hands full and his guard down. He met Thomas and Eleanor in the yard. He looked at Eleanor with the cautious look of a man who had heard things and wasn't sure yet how to weight them. Thomas noticed it. Eleanor noticed it too. Thomas could tell by the slight straightening of her spine the conscious decision to address it rather than work around it. "Mr. Svensson," she said, "I know you've heard things about me this week. I'm not going to pretend you haven't." Pete looked at her. "I heard some things," he said carefully. "What specifically?" she said. He shifted his weight. "That you had some trouble back east. Business dealings that went bad. That maybe you came out here carrying that. I came out here carrying the consequences of what Richard Caldwell did to my family," she said. "The business dealings that went bad because he paid a man to falsify our accounts and then moved in to acquire the assets when we collapsed." She looked at Pete steadily. "He is now trying to do the same thing in this valley. And he is trying to discredit me so that the people here won't believe that when I say it." Pete was quiet for a moment. "That's a serious accusation," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is. And I am willing to put my name on it in front of a federal land commissioner in 10 days. She paused. "The question I came to ask you, Mr. Svensson, is whether Caldwell has been to see you." Pete's jaw tightened. "Yesterday evening," he said. "What did he offer?" Pete told her. The number was even lower than what he'd offered Hal. Eleanor didn't react to the number itself. She said, "What is your property actually worth?" Pete told her that too. "He offered you less than half of value," she said. "He said the market was. He said what he always says," she said quietly, "that things are going to get difficult, and this is the safe option, and the people telling you otherwise have unclear motives." She looked at him. "I have very clear motives, Mr. Svensson. I want this man stopped. Because if he isn't stopped here, he'll do this somewhere else to someone else who can't afford to lose what they have." She paused. "The same way my family couldn't afford to lose what we had." Pete Svensson looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at Thomas. "She always talked like this," he said. Thomas almost smiled. "Every day," he said. Pete looked back at Eleanor. "My Martha's sick," he said. "I won't pretend that money wouldn't help." "I know," Eleanor said. "And I'm not here to tell you not to take it. I'm here to tell you what it actually is before you decide." She held his gaze. "If you sell to Caldwell, you get less than half of what your land is worth, and he gets another piece of the eastern tributary water rights, and in 2 years this valley looks very different. If you hold, and if the federal inquiry goes the way I believe it will, your land is worth what it's worth, and Caldwell is gone. And if the inquiry doesn't go the way you believe," Pete said, "then you still have your land, and he still has to come back to you," she said. "His offer doesn't disappear if you wait 10 days." Pete looked at the ground. He was quiet for a long moment. "10 days," he said. "10 days," Eleanor said. He looked up. "All right," he said. 10 days. Thomas drove them back to the farm in the late afternoon. Eleanor was quiet for most of the ride. Not withdrawn, just processing, which was different. He'd learned the difference over weeks of watching her think. "You handled that well," he said. "I told him the truth," she said. "That's not handling something. That's just telling the truth." "Some people can't tell the difference," he said. She looked at him. "You always could," she said. He kept his eyes on the road. But he felt that land somewhere. He didn't say anything about it. Sometimes the things that mattered most didn't need a response. They just needed to be received. The night of day 6 was when everything broke open. Thomas woke at 2 a.m. to the sound of Joe hammering on his door. He was dressed and downstairs in under a minute. Joe was breathing hard. "Svensson's barn," Joe said. "It's on fire." Thomas went cold. He turned to get his coat and nearly walked into Eleanor, who was already in the hallway with her boots on. "I heard," she said. "Stay here," Thomas said. "Thomas." "Eleanor." He held her gaze for 1 second. "Please." She stopped. He and Joe rode hard. The barn was already gone by the time they arrived. The structure itself was beyond saving, but the house was untouched, and Pete Svensson and his wife Martha were standing in the yard, Martha in a blanket and Pete in his work clothes, with the look of a man who'd been awake when it started. Two of the Tanner brothers were already there. Hal Dexter came in behind Thomas and Joe. Thomas went straight to Pete. "Anyone hurt?" he said. "No," Pete said. His voice was flat, controlled in the way that follows shock. "The animals got them out." Pete looked at the remains of the barn. It was Set Thomas. The words landed in the cold night air like something with weight. "You're sure?" Thomas said. "I smelled it before I heard it," Pete said. "Same smell as a lantern that's been knocked over, but there was no lantern in that barn. I'm careful about that with Martha the way she is." He looked at Thomas. "Someone put fire to that barn deliberately." Thomas heard one of the Tanner brothers say something low and hard under his breath. Hal said Caldwell. Nobody confirmed it. Nobody denied it. They didn't have to. Thomas looked at the sky, still dark, still 4 hours from light. "Joe," he said. "Already thinking it," Joe said. "Ride to Gus's place. Tell him what happened. Tell him we need to move up the timeline however we can." "It's 2 in the morning," Joe said. "I know what time it is," Thomas said. Joe rode. Thomas turned to Pete. "You and Martha come back to my place tonight," he said. "You can sort out where you stand in the morning." Pete looked at him. "I'm not going to be moved off my land," Pete said. "I know you're not," Thomas said. "I'm asking you to bring your sick wife inside a warm house for the rest of the night. That's all." Pete's jaw worked. "All right," he said quietly. They brought Martha to the wagon carefully. The woman was pale and exhausted, and she gripped Pete's hand with both of hers and didn't let go. Thomas drove them back. Eleanor had not stayed put. He found her at the kitchen table when he came in with Pete and Martha. And the kitchen was warm and lit, and there was food on the stove, and a room prepared down the hall. He looked at her across the kitchen, and she looked back at him with an expression that said clearly, "I know you said to stay, and I made a different decision, and I'm not apologizing for it." He didn't say anything about it. He helped Pete get Martha settled. He came back to the kitchen. Eleanor handed him coffee. He sat down. "He set the fire," Thomas said. "I know," she said. "You knew he would do something like this." "I knew he would escalate," she said. "I didn't know exactly how." She sat across from him. Her face was very serious. "Thomas, this is past a land dispute now. This is criminal intimidation. If Aldous hears about this—" "He will hear about it," Thomas said. "Joe's gone to Gus." She nodded. "There's something else," she said. He looked at her. "If Caldwell set that fire tonight, it means he knows about the 10-day timeline. It means someone told him about our conversation with Pete." She held his gaze. "Someone in this valley is talking to him." The kitchen was very quiet. Thomas thought about it. He ran through the people who knew about the Aldous visit, the timeline, the conversation with Pete. The list wasn't long. "Pearson," he said. "That's my guess too," she said. "The bank. He would have access to financial information about most of the valley farmers. He'd know who was vulnerable." She looked at the table. "And Caldwell met with him privately before the talk started in town." Thomas stood up. "I'm going to ride to Haskell at the land registry when it's light," he said. "If Pearson has been feeding Caldwell information about depositors, that's a separate matter from the land fraud. That's a banking violation." "Wait," Eleanor said. He looked at her. She was already at the table with paper and her pen. "Don't go to Haskell," she said. "Haskell met with Caldwell too, remember. We don't know where he stands." She was writing quickly. "Write directly to the Territorial Banking Commissioner. I'll draft the letter. It needs to go with Joe to the county seat today separately from the Gus channel." She looked up. 2 fronts. Caldwell can try to block one. He can't block both at the same time. Thomas looked at her, at the speed of her mind moving. at the absolute clarity with which she assessed a situation and identified the pressure points. He thought about Gus asking where he'd found her, and Hal Dexter asking the same thing, and Joe's measured understatement that first week she was right about the drainage. He thought about the letter he'd written in February, asking for something practical and simple. "Draft the letter," he said. She was already writing. Day 7 brought Caldwell to town in a way he hadn't shown himself before. He walked into the general store on a Thursday morning while 3 Valley women were inside Mrs. Tanner. Mrs. Dexter and a younger woman named Ruth Calloway, whose husband ran a small operation on the West Range. He didn't speak to them directly. He spoke to the storekeeper loudly enough that everyone present could hear. He said he was concerned about the situation developing in the valley. He said he'd heard a federal inquiry had been requested, and he wanted people to know he welcomed any scrutiny of his business dealings, which were entirely legitimate. He said he hoped the good people of this valley wouldn't be misled by individuals who had personal reasons to discredit honest commerce. He didn't say Eleanor's name. He didn't have to. Mrs. Dexter came directly to the Whitaker farm from the store and told Eleanor everything, word for word in the kitchen, with the precise recall of a woman who had understood she was witnessing something and had committed it to memory accordingly. When she finished, Eleanor thanked her. When Mrs. Dexter left, Eleanor stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then she said to Thomas, who had been listening from the doorway, "He's scared." Thomas frowned. He didn't sound scared. "He went into town and made that speech," she said. "Caldwell doesn't make speeches. He doesn't explain himself publicly. He works quietly and lets others make noise." She turned to face Thomas. "He went in there and talked because he's trying to get ahead of something he knows is coming." She paused. "He wouldn't do that unless he knew the federal angle was real." Thomas thought about it. "Someone told him about Aldous," he said. "Or he has his own contacts in Helena," she said. "Men like Caldwell always do." Thomas looked at her. "What do you want to do?" he said. She thought for exactly 4 seconds. "I want to go into town," she said. "Eleanor." "I want to walk into Cutter's Creek and be visible and let people see me," she said. "He's been making me a shadow, a rumor, something people have heard about but not seen clearly." She met Thomas's eyes. "I want them to see me clearly." He looked at her for a long moment. "I'm coming with you," he said. "I know you are," she said. They went into town that afternoon. Thomas didn't hover. He didn't position himself between her and people. He simply walked alongside her, the way a man walks alongside someone whose right to be somewhere he takes completely for granted. Eleanor spoke to people. Not about Caldwell. Not about the inquiry. Not about any of it directly. She spoke to Mrs. Haskell about the difficulty of keeping a kitchen garden through a Montana summer. And Mrs. Haskell, who had been barely speaking to her a week ago, talked back fully and with genuine interest because Mrs. Haskell loved her kitchen garden, and nobody had ever asked about it with the specific knowledgeable attention Eleanor brought to it. She spoke to the doctor's wife about preserving methods for the coming winter and ended up standing outside the dry goods for 20 minutes in a conversation that drew in 2 other women who had opinions about pickling that they had apparently been waiting for an occasion to share. She bought her supplies. She thanked the storekeeper by name. She walked out. Thomas fell into step beside her. "That was," he started. "He made me a rumor," she said quietly, walking. "I just reminded people that I'm a person." He was quiet for a moment. "It worked," he said. "People are decent mostly," she said. "They just need a reason to act like it." He thought about that for the rest of the drive home. Day 9. One day before Aldous arrived, Thomas was out checking the cattle when Joe came running across the field, actually running, which Joe Briggs did, approximately never. And Thomas knew before Joe reached him that something had changed. "Caldwell filed an injunction," Joe said, breathing hard, "against the water rights contest. He's claiming the contest was filed under false pretenses, that the primary witness, meaning Eleanor, has a documented history of fraudulent business dealings, and her testimony is therefore tainted." Thomas stared at him. "Can he do that?" he said. "He did it," Joe said. "I heard from Haskell's clerk 20 minutes ago. The filing went in this morning. If it holds, it could stall the contest long enough for the original petition to finalize." Thomas turned and walked toward the house. He didn't run. Running was for emergencies, and this wasn't an emergency. This was Caldwell making his last move, and Thomas needed to think, not panic. Eleanor was in the kitchen. She was standing at the counter with her back to the door, and something in the set of her shoulders told him she'd already heard. He walked in. She turned. Her face was controlled. Perfectly carefully controlled, with the particular effort of someone holding something very heavy, very still. "Haskell's wife came by," she said, 20 minutes ago. "Joe just told me," he said. She turned back to the counter. "He's calling me a fraud," she said. "Formally, in a legal filing." Her voice was flat. "If that sticks—" "It's not going to stick," Thomas said. "Thomas, it's not going to stick," he said again. He crossed the kitchen. He stopped close enough that she had to turn and face him. "Listen to me. Aldous arrives tomorrow. He's coming because there is a pattern across multiple territories that your documentation helped establish. One injunction filed by the man being investigated doesn't undo that." "He's calling my character into question in a federal context," she said. "That follows me. Even if we win, that follows me. Then we make sure we win so completely that there's nothing left to follow," Thomas said. She looked at him. Her composure was holding, but barely. He could see the cost of it in her eyes, not fear exactly, but something close to it. The exhaustion of someone who has fought this before and lost, and knows exactly what losing feels like, and is feeling the shape of that possibility pressing against the present moment. "Eleanor," he said. She waited. "When you got off that stagecoach," he said, "you asked me about the water supply. First thing. Before hello. Before anything." She blinked. "You were already figuring out how this place worked," he said. "You were already thinking about what it needed and how to make it better." He held her gaze. "You've been doing that every day since. Not for what you'd get from it. Not to impress anyone. Just because you saw things that needed doing, and you did them." He paused. "A fraud doesn't do that." She was very still. "A fraud performs," he said. "You work. There's a difference. And everyone who has been in this house for the past 9 weeks knows the difference, and Aldous will know the difference the moment he meets you." She looked at him for a long, quiet moment. Then something in her that had been rigid released, not collapsed, not crumpled, but released like a hand that's been gripping something too long, finally allowing itself to open. "You are," she said carefully, "very sure of things." "I'm sure of the things I've seen with my own eyes," he said. "I've been watching you for 9 weeks. That's more than enough." She looked at him. He looked at her. Something had been building between them for 9 weeks, slowly, steadily, the way the things that last are built, and it was here now, fully present, impossible to talk around. "Thomas," she said. "I know," he said. "I haven't said anything yet," she said. "I know what you were going to say," he said. She almost smiled. "You're very confident about that," she said. "Am I wrong?" he said. She was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "You're not wrong." He reached out. He took her hand, not dramatically, not with any of the theater of the gesture, just the plain, factual movement of a man picking up something he's been careful not to break. She looked at their hands. Then she looked up at him. "When this is over," she said. "When this is over," he agreed. She squeezed his hand once. Then she let go. She turned back to the counter. "I need to prepare my response to the injunction," she said. "For Aldous. He needs to see it before Caldwell gets to him first." "What do you need?" Thomas said. "Paper," she said. "And someone to read what I write and tell me if it's clear." "I can do that," he said. She looked at him over her shoulder. "I know you can," she said. He got the paper. He sat at the table. She wrote. He read. They worked through the evening and into the night side by side at the kitchen table, the lamp burning low, the house quiet around them. In the good way, it had been quiet recently, full of something that wasn't absence, full of something that had a name neither of them had said out loud yet, but that both of them already knew. Outside Cutter's Creek waited. Aldous was 1 day away. Caldwell had made his move, and Eleanor Hayes, who had arrived on a stagecoach 9 weeks ago with one suitcase and a faded leather notebook, sat at Thomas Whitaker's kitchen table and wrote the clearest, most precise account of the truth that Thomas had ever read. He told her that. She looked at him. "The truth is easy to write," she said. "It already knows its own shape." He looked at the pages in his hands. He thought about everything that had arrived at his farm 9 weeks ago. Not just the woman, but the warmth and the noise and the coffee for two and the full dinner table and the laughter he'd forgotten how to generate and the conversations on the porch and the drainage channel and the cattle saved and the valley warned and the two of them sitting here right now shoulder to shoulder against something that had tried its best to separate them. He thought about the letter he'd written in February. He thought about the word reliable. He almost laughed. He set the pages down. "It's good," he said. "It's more than good." "Enough," she said. "More than enough," he said. She took a breath. She took the pages back. She read them once more from the beginning. Then she set them down and looked at the table and was still for just a moment, gathering herself the way a person gathers themselves before something important. Then she looked up. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow," Thomas said. He poured them each a last cup of coffee. They drank it in the good quiet. And in the morning, Frank Aldous would come to Cutter's Creek, and everything that had been building for 9 weeks. The truth and the fight, and the thing between them that had no name yet, but was already stronger than anything Caldwell had brought against them, would come to its reckoning. But tonight they were at the table in the warmth with the lamp burning, and the work done, and the 2 cups of coffee between them. Tonight that was enough. Frank Aldous arrived on a Tuesday morning in a plain wagon with a single traveling bag, and the unhurried manner of a man who had been doing his job long enough to know that urgency and haste were 2 different things, and that only one of them was useful. He was 61 years old, lean and weathered, with the kind of eyes that had spent decades reading documents and people in equal measure, and had gotten very good at both. He wore no badge. He carried no visible authority. He looked, Thomas thought, like a retired school teacher who had made peace with everything except dishonesty. Gus met him at the edge of town and brought him directly to the Whitaker farm. Thomas was in the yard when they arrived. Aldous climbed down from the wagon and looked at the farm the way a man looks at something he's heard described and is now measuring against the description. Then he looked at Thomas. "Mr. Whitaker," he said. "Thank you for having me." "Thank you for coming," Thomas said. "Is Miss Hayes here?" "She's inside," Thomas said. Aldous nodded. "Then let's not waste the morning," he said. Eleanor had the table prepared the way she prepared everything, completely without excess. The documentation was organized in the order Aldous would need it. Coffee was made. She was standing when they came in, not hovering, just present. Aldous looked at her the way he'd looked at the farm, assessing, calibrating. "Miss Hayes," he said. "Mr. Aldous," she said. "Please sit down." He sat. He picked up the first document. He read. Thomas and Gus sat at the edges of the table and didn't speak, because Eleanor had asked them not to, unless Aldous asked them a direct question, and they had both agreed to that without argument. Aldous read for 40 minutes straight. He didn't ask questions during that time. He read the way a man reads when he already knows the shape of what he's looking for and is confirming that the shape is there. When he finished the last page, he set it down. He looked at Eleanor. "The Hanson well," he said. "Yes," she said. "You believe it was deliberately disabled?" "I believe the probability is high enough to investigate," she said. "I'm not a well engineer, but the original drilling record shows no structural weakness, and the failure was sudden, not progressive." She paused. Caldwell needed that property. Ed Hanson wasn't going to sell without a compelling reason. Then suddenly he had one. Aldous looked at her. In the Dakotas 2 years ago, he said a similar pattern. A fence line fire. Not a barn, just a fence. But in winter, with cattle that needed containment. He folded his hands on the table. The farmer sold within a week, to a land-holding company called Continental Range Partners. Eleanor was very still. "Which is also Caldwell," she said. "Which is also Caldwell," Aldous confirmed. The kitchen was very quiet. "How many?" Thomas said. Aldous looked at him. "This will be the 4th territory where we've found his footprint," he said. "Oregon, Wyoming, Dakota, and now Montana." He paused. "Each time the same structure. Quiet acquisitions. Local contacts in banking and land registry. Below-value offers framed as protection. Escalating pressure when the quiet approach is resisted." "And each time before," Gus said. "What happened?" "Each time before he got what he wanted," Aldous said. "Or enough of it that it wasn't worth the fight." He looked at Eleanor. "Until now." Eleanor held his gaze. "What changed?" she said. "You did," Aldous said simply. "Specifically, your documentation of the Pennsylvania operation. It connected 4 separate incidents into a single pattern. Without that connection, each territory looks like a local dispute. With it," he tapped the pages. "With it, it's federal fraud across multiple territories." Thomas looked at Eleanor. She was looking at the table. He knew what she was thinking because he'd watched her think long enough to recognize the shape of it. She was thinking about her mother handing her that notebook. She was thinking about a dying woman who had known exactly what she was preserving and why. She looked up. "What do you need from me?" she said. "I need your formal testimony," Aldous said. "A sworn account of the Pennsylvania operation cross-referenced with what you've observed here. I also need you to appear at a formal hearing, likely in Helena, within the month." "When?" she said. "I'll set the date once I've reviewed everything and spoken to the other valley landowners." He paused. "But there's something you should know first." He reached into his traveling bag. He pulled out a document. He set it on the table in front of Eleanor. She looked at it. Thomas looked at it. It was a legal filing. The header read, "In the matter of Hayes versus Aldridge and Pacific Meridian Holdings Eastern District." "This was filed in Pennsylvania 6 months ago," Aldous said. "By your father's original attorney. The partial case that was opened after the collapse." He looked at Eleanor. "It was closed when there weren't sufficient resources to continue it. But the filing is still active." Eleanor stared at this document. "My father's attorney," she said slowly. "Mr. Brennan." "He never stopped working on it," Aldous said. "Quietly in his own time. He apparently believed the case had merit, even when there were no funds to pursue it." He paused. "What you've given me today connects his Pennsylvania filing to the Montana evidence. If I add the Dakota and Oregon records—" He stopped. He let Eleanor finish the thought. She looked up at him. "That's not a local fraud case," she said. "No," Aldous said. "It's not." "That's a federal criminal prosecution," she said. "That is exactly what it is," Aldous said. The room was so quiet, Thomas could hear the wind off the north ridge moving around the barn. Gus Peterman made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Eleanor sat with it. She sat with it for a long moment, the full weight of what it meant. Not just for the valley. Not just for Caldwell's plans here. But for her family. For her father sitting in Ohio diminished and far away. For her mother who had given her a notebook instead of the goodbye she deserved. For everything that had been taken and not returned. Thomas watched her face. He watched her take it in without breaking. "What do I need to do?" she said. Her voice was steady, completely steady. Aldous looked at her with the expression of a man who has seen a lot of witnesses in a lot of circumstances and knows which ones will hold. "Everything you've already been doing," he said. "Exactly the way you've been doing it." Caldwell found out about Aldous' arrival by noon. Thomas didn't know how. He'd stopped being surprised by the speed of Caldwell's information. The man had roots in this town that ran deeper than his visible presence suggested, and pulling them out completely would take time that they didn't have today. What Caldwell did with the information was not what Thomas expected. He expected another filing, another maneuver through the bank or the land commission, another quiet move designed to stall and redirect. Instead, Caldwell came to the farm. The third time. He drove up in the early afternoon while Aldous was still inside reviewing documents with Eleanor and Gus. Thomas was on the porch, and he stood up when he saw the wagon coming, and he walked down to the gate the way he had before, and he put himself between Caldwell and the house the way he had before. But this time, Caldwell's face was different. The pleasantness was gone. What was underneath it was not quite anger, it was colder than anger, more calculated. The face of a man who has lost a move and is deciding in real time what comes next. "I know Aldous is here," Caldwell said. "Good," Thomas said. "You understand what you've done," Caldwell said. "You've taken a local business matter and turned it into a federal proceeding. That affects people beyond this valley. Investors, partners, people who have nothing to do with—" "Stop," Thomas said. Caldwell stopped. "You want to tell me about the people who'll be affected," Thomas said. "That's your move. Make it about scale. Make it about consequence. Make the thing you did seem smaller than the response to it." He looked at Caldwell evenly. "Ed Hanson's well, the Svensson barn, my valley's water rights. You want to stand here and talk to me about consequence?" Caldwell was very still. "You can't prove the well," he said. His voice had dropped. The polished reasonableness was completely gone now. What was left was the operational center of the man, precise, cold, and fully capable of deciding that directness was the only remaining option. "Not yet," Thomas said. "Or the barn." "Not yet," Thomas said again. Caldwell looked at him. "Then what exactly does Aldous have?" he said. "Enough," Thomas said. "More than enough. But you know that. That's why you're here." Caldwell was quiet. He looked past Thomas at the house again, that same look he'd had the second visit. The measuring look toward where Eleanor was. Thomas moved again. Same half step. Same deliberate positioning. Caldwell noticed it again. This time, something in his expression didn't just recalculate. Something in it conceded. "She's going to testify," Caldwell said. "Yes," Thomas said. "It will be contested." "Yes," Thomas said. "It will be. And it will hold." Caldwell looked at him. "You're very certain," he said. "I've been watching her for 10 weeks," Thomas said. "I've never once seen her wrong about something that mattered." Caldwell held his gaze for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "She was wrong about her father's partner." The words were intended to cut. They found the mark. Thomas felt them. But he also knew exactly what they were, the last instrument a man reaches for when everything else is gone. The personal. The wound. The thing that can't be unfiled or unconstructed. "She wasn't wrong about him," Thomas said. "She trusted him because he'd earned trust. That's not a mistake. That's what trust is." He held Caldwell's gaze. "You're the one who made it a mistake, and you've been making that same mistake in 4 territories, and it's done." Caldwell stared at him. For the first time since the first day he'd appeared on this porch, Thomas saw something move in his face that wasn't calculation. It was the brief, involuntary expression of a man who has just heard the exact shape of his own life described back to him by someone else, and found that shape smaller than he thought. It lasted less than a second. Then Caldwell picked up his reins. "Tell Miss Hayes," he said carefully, "that I hope the hearing goes as she expects." "I'll tell her nothing from you," Thomas said. Caldwell drove away. This time Thomas didn't watch him go. He turned and walked back to the house. He found Eleanor standing just inside the door. She'd heard. He could see it in her face. She'd heard most of it, or enough of it, and what she was doing now was deciding how to hold what she'd heard without letting it move her off the ground she was standing on. "He's going to contest everything," she said. "Yes," Thomas said. "He is." It could take months, the hearing, the testimony, the counterfilings. Yes, Thomas said. And until it's resolved, people in this town are still going to have opinions about who I am and why I'm here and whether I can be trusted. Her voice was steady, but he could hear what was underneath the steadiness, the way you can hear water running under frozen ground. That's going to be hard. Yes, Thomas said. It is. She looked at him. You keep saying yes, she said. Because you keep being right, he said. She pressed her lips together. I need you to tell me something that isn't yes, she said. He looked at her. He thought about what the truest thing was. It's going to be hard, he said, and we're going to get through it. And when it's done, this valley is going to be different because you were here. He paused. That's not yes. That's just true. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, Thomas. What? I need to ask you something, she said. He waited. When the hearing is over, she said carefully, and this is settled one way or the other, and the agency's 3-month arrangement has long since passed. She stopped. Started again. What are we? He looked at her. He thought about February, about a letter written 4 times, about a practical arrangement, about a woman stepping off a stagecoach and asking about water logistics before she'd said hello. He thought about 2 cups of coffee made without deciding to. We're what we've been for 10 weeks, he said. I just haven't said it plainly yet. Say it plainly, she said. He held her gaze. I want you to stay, he said. Not because the farm needs you. Not because you're useful. Not because you fit into a space that needed filling. He paused. Because when you're not here, the kitchen is loud in the bad way again. Because you're the first person I've talked to in 6 years who talks back in a way that makes me want to keep talking. Because I have watched you fight for this valley, and these people, and this farm, and I have not once seen you fight for anything less than the truths. And that is... He stopped. That is the rarest thing I have ever seen. Eleanor was very still. That's not a simple answer, she said. Her voice was slightly unsteady. No, he said, it's not. She looked at him. All right, she said. All right, you'll stay, he said. Or all right, you heard me. All right, I'll stay, she said. All right, I heard you. All right to all of it. He took a breath. She looked at him with the open, unguarded expression of someone who has put down something heavy they've been carrying for a long time and is figuring out what it feels like to stand without the weight. I came here, she said quietly, because I needed somewhere that wasn't what everything had become. I needed somewhere I could be more than what happened to my family. She looked at him. I didn't expect to find someone who would stand at a gate and argue with a man like Caldwell about what trust means. I didn't expect to find someone who dug 40 feet of drainage channel without telling me, he said. She almost laughed. He almost smiled. Neither of them moved. Then Thomas reached out and took her hand the same way he had in the kitchen the night before the injunction. Plain and factual, the movement of a man certain of what he's reaching for. She held it. When this is over, he said. When this is over, she said. It was enough. The formal hearing was held in Helena 5 weeks later. Thomas was there. Joe was there. Gus Peterman was there. Hal Dexter came, and Pete Svensson, who had rebuilt his barn with the help of every man in the valley over a single long weekend. The Tanner brothers came. Ruth Calloway's husband came. 7 Valley men who had never been to Helena in their lives sat in a federal hearing room and told Frank Aldis and the panel everything they had seen. Eleanor testified for 2 hours. Thomas sat in the room and watched her do it. She was not nervous. She was not theatrical. She spoke in the same clear, direct way she spoke at his kitchen table, precisely without embellishment, with the particular authority of someone who knows that the truth has its own shape and doesn't need decoration. She walked the panel through Pennsylvania. She walked them through Montana. She connected the water rights strategy to the Pennsylvania distribution scheme. She produced the documentation she had spent 5 weeks organizing into a chronology so clear that even a man unfamiliar with agricultural land law could follow it without effort. When Caldwell's attorney rose to cross-examine her, he had 3 lines of attack prepared. She answered each one with specific dates, specific documents, and specific amounts. By the 3rd answer, the attorney sat down. The panel chair looked at the documentation. He looked at Eleanor. He said, "Miss Hayes, in your assessment, what was the ultimate objective of the Pacific Meridian operations across these 4 territories?" Eleanor said control, not of any single farm or any single water supply, of the pattern of acquisition and leverage that would eventually allow one entity to set terms for agricultural operations across an entire region. She paused. "My family's business was destroyed not because we were weak, but because we were useful. He didn't eliminate us, he absorbed us. What he couldn't absorb, he discredited." She looked at the panel chair. "He operates the same way every time because it works. The only way to stop it from working is to show all 4 territories at once." The panel chair looked at the documentation for a long moment. Then he looked at Aldous. Aldous nodded once. The decision came 12 days after the hearing. It came in a letter addressed to Frank Aldous, with copies to the land registries of 4 territories. Pacific Meridian Holdings was ordered to divest its Montana acquisitions at full assessed value. The water rights petition was denied permanently. A federal fraud investigation was formally opened into Richard Caldwell's operations across Oregon, Wyoming. Dakota and Montana connected to the existing Pennsylvania civil case. Caldwell was not in Cutter's Creek when the decision arrived. He had left the territory 9 days after the hearing. Nobody watched him go. The letter from Mr. Brennan arrived 2 weeks after the federal decision. It was addressed to Eleanor Kerr of the Whitaker Farm, Cutter's Creek, Montana. Thomas handed it to her without comment. She read it standing in the kitchen. When she finished, she stood with it for a moment. Then she set it on the table. "Brennan says the Pennsylvania case has been reopened," she said. "The federal connection gives it standing it didn't have before." Her voice was careful and controlled in the way it always was when she was carrying something significant. "He says there's a reasonable chance of a partial recovery of my father's assets." Thomas looked at her. "That's good," he said. "It might mean my father could—" She stopped. "He might be able to come back from what happened. Not all the way, but—" She stopped again. She pressed her hand flat on the letter. She didn't cry, but she stood very still for a long moment, and Thomas stood with her without moving or speaking, because this was one of those moments that didn't need anything added to it. Then she looked up. "Thank you," she said. "You did this," he said. "We did this," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "we did." The valley changed in the months that followed. Brewster and Hanson recovered their properties at fair value from the Pacific Meridian divestiture. Pete Svensson's barn stood rebuilt and solid, and Martha Svensson began to improve through the winter, slowly but visibly in the way of someone who had been carrying dread alongside illness and had been relieved of one of those burdens. The valley dinner that Eleanor organized in early November wasn't planned as a celebration. She called it a working supper and evening for the valley families to share what they knew about winter preparation, crop planning, soil management. She brought her notebook. Other women brought their own accumulated knowledge. Men who had farmed this land for decades and had never sat in the same room to compare methods discovered that they had answers to each other's oldest problems. It went 4 hours. When it ended, Gus Peterman stood up at the end of the table. He was not a man who made speeches. He said, "We have been farming this valley for 30 years in the same direction as each other without knowing it. I think we have Miss Hayes to thank for getting us into the same room." There was a sound from around the table that was more than agreement. Eleanor looked at the table. She didn't deflect it. She didn't minimize it. She said, "Next year we do it in spring too." The room agreed. Thomas asked her to marry him on a Wednesday evening in December on the porch, in the cold, which was not the most comfortable setting, and which he acknowledged freely. Eleanor pointed out that it was below freezing. He said he was aware of that. She said there was a perfectly warm kitchen 6 feet behind them. He said he knew that too. She looked at him. "You chose the porch on purpose," she said. "Clara liked the evenings on this porch," he said. "So do you." He looked at her. "I wanted to ask you somewhere that—" He stopped, started again. "I wanted to ask you somewhere that wasn't just mine anymore." Eleanor was quiet. She understood what he meant. She understood it completely. "Yes," she said. "That's it," he said. "Yes," she said again. "That's it. Yes." He took her hand. The cold was significant. They went inside after a reasonable amount of time standing in it. They were married in the spring in the yard of the Whitaker farm, with the whole valley present and the kitchen producing enough food to feed everyone twice. Gus Peterman stood up and said something that Thomas would remember for the rest of his life. He said, "A man who farms this land learns one thing above everything else. You cannot force a harvest. You can prepare the ground. You can do the work. But what grows is what belongs here." He looked at Thomas and Eleanor. "What's in front of us today belongs here." Nobody disagreed. Years later, the Whitaker farm was known throughout Montana Territory for things that couldn't be listed on a land assessment. It was known because when a new family came into the valley with nothing, they found a meal waiting, and a woman who could tell them which soil needed what, and which creek bend flooded in spring, and how to make food that lasted through a winter from what the land provided. It was known because Thomas Whitaker, who had once measured everything in yields and fence lines, had learned to measure differently in the number of people around his table, in the sound of his house on a winter evening, in the particular quality of a silence shared with someone who made silence feel like company instead of absence. It was known because Eleanor Hayes had arrived with one suitcase and a leather notebook, and had refused quietly and completely to be only what anyone had decided she was before they knew her. And it was known because sometimes, not often, but sometimes Joe Briggs would tell the story of the morning he came to find Thomas in the barn and said, "Your wife," and Thomas had said, "She's not my wife yet," with a face that already knew she was. Joe told it well. He always had been a man with opinions. The farm stood, the valley held, the notebook passed on, not lost, not taken, not destroyed by anything Caldwell or the years had tried to do to it. And the recipes in it fed people who needed feeding the same as they always had. The same as Eleanor's grandmother had always intended. And Thomas Whitaker, who had written a letter in February asking for something practical and simple, who had stood at a stagecoach stop expecting a quiet woman who would fit neatly into an empty space, understood finally and completely what he had actually received. Not what he had ordered. Not what he had imagined. Something he hadn't known how to ask for because he hadn't known it existed until it stepped off a stage in Montana with mud on its boots and asked about the water supply. He had received someone whose arrival had reminded him that a life is not a farm to be managed, but a home to be built, and that the difference between those two things was everything. That was what Eleanor Hayes brought to the Whitaker farm. Not just knowledge, not just skill, not just the courage to fight and the clarity to win. She brought back the thing Thomas had locked away 6 years ago when he couldn't afford to carry it anymore. She brought back the belief that what came next could be better than what came before. And it was. It absolutely was.